Welcome to the Cedar Creek Bible in a Year podcast. Whether you are listening on your own, with a friend, or a group of friends, we hope this podcast helps you connect with Scripture and also enriches your relationship with God. Here are your hosts, Luke Shortridge and Andy Rechtenwald.
Hi, everybody. Cedar Creek Radio is on the air. Luke Shortridge and Andy Rechtenwald coming at you. Andy, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. So today we are looking at the very exciting, thrilling book of Leviticus. And the crowd goes wild. Woo! So, what do you think, Andy? You excited about Leviticus?
I think Leviticus gets a bad rap.
Yes, it does.
I think it does. I think there's some very interesting stuff in Leviticus and some very important stuff in Leviticus.
Totally agree.
And since many people who don't believe in God attack God and the Bible based on the book of Leviticus.
This is a popular one.
I think it's very important that we know and understand the book of Leviticus better so we can, answer those objections. My opinion, not popular, but that's what I think.
Andy, where does the term Leviticus come from?
I think the term Leviticus comes from the Levites.
Yes.
So that's what I think.
Yeah.
But I think it comes from the Hebrew word for it is different. It was really interesting when you look at the Hebrew words for the books of the Pentateuch, the first five, compared to the Greek ones. The names we use are the Greek.
The Septuagint?
Yeah.
Ah.
So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are all Greek words, technically, and then the Hebrew ones are totally different.
Fascinating.
Pretty fascinating, huh?
Now, I wonder with the Torah if they even separated out, the Torah being the first 5 books of the Bible. I don't know. We'd have to do a little research. We'll get the research department on that. My understanding from the Septuagint, Eric just shrugged his shoulders. My understanding, the Levitical priests, the Levites, this is a book of laws and rules governing ceremonial worship and everyday living, but primarily it's about how to worship God, how to live your life, for Him. So we're going to get heavy into the law here, but first, I thought we would have a little fun and play everyone's favorite game, Leviticus, Louisiana, or Luke, in which I give you a bizarre law, and you tell me if this is a law from Leviticus, is it from the state of Louisiana, or is it just Luke made it up?
Something Luke made up. Oh, good. This will be fun.
These are your favorites. So, we'll jump right in here. It is illegal to wear pants made from 2 different types of material.
Illegal or legal?
It is illegal.
Oh, okay, you said legal first. That's what confused me. Leviticus.
That is correct, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Softball one right there?
Yeah.
It's going to get a lot more difficult,
I thought maybe it'd be so obvious that you would want to change it up. You are correct. This comes from Leviticus 19:19. Do not wear clothing woven of 2 different kinds of material.
Yes.
Great job, Andy. You're right on your way.
Okay, 101.
101. Next, it is illegal to urinate in a water supply.
Louisiana.
Yeah, yes. How'd you know?
Okay, full disclosure. when I wrote
it's gonna be good.
It's not that good. I was like, why are you guys laughing so hard? No, I've never experienced the negative effects of breaking that law. But when I was putting together trivia, because when I thought I was writing the trivia for this one, I looked up wacky laws, and that was one of them. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, so 2 for 2.
All right. It is illegal to get a bowl cut.
Luke.
That is Leviticus. Leviticus 19:27. You shall not round the corners of your heads.
I don't think that's what they meant, but I'll give it to you.
Yeah, shaving the temples.
Around the corners
you ever see
of your
the
head.
curly?
That's not a bowl cut, though. You have to do the whole thing.
Well,
it's part of the bowl cut.
You'll never make it as a Levitical priest, Andy.
Hey,
I don't have a bowl cut.
Where are the corners on your head?
Depends on what kind of head you have.
Well, if it's round, it's all the way around.
All right, let's pull it together here. Okay, next.
Well,
it is illegal to make
Sorry.
fun of Popeye the Sailor Man.
Luke.
Yeah, dang it.
You never know, because there are those really weird laws on, state laws. Ugh.
Well, I was hoping you'd think about Popeye's Chicken, which is a national treasure of Louisiana.
No, I didn't think
it at all.
No.
Okay, next. It is illegal to kiss your pet pig.
Louisiana.
Nope, that's Luke. Dang, I thought you were going to go Leviticus on this one, because there are some crazy laws which we're not going to mention.
I don't recall anything being about kissing
About
animals. Other things about animals, though.
That's true. Good point.
Which is sad that had to be said, but it did.
Yep.
It's in
Okay.
there.
It is illegal to steal your neighbor's alligator.
Louisiana.
Yep, totally is.
I knew alligator wasn't mentioned in the Bible, so I had to eliminate that one. But I didn't know.
I should have said behemoth. No.
That would have gotten me.
Yeah, this is punishable by up to 10 years in prison.
Stealing an alligator? I
Yes.
guess they're pretty expensive pets. They have to be.
Sounds right to me. Okay, next up. It is illegal to cook and eat the electric eel.
Leviticus.
Totally is Leviticus. Great
It's
job.
an unclean animal, huh?
Yep. All that have not fins and scales in the seas. I think this is New King James Version. In the rivers of all that move in the waters of any living thing which is in the waters, they shall be an abomination unto you. Yeah, it was definitely New King James. So, yeah, basically you can eat fish, and that's about it.
Yep.
Okay. It is illegal to kill an alligator with a borrowed weapon.
With a borrowed weapon? Louisiana.
It's totally Luke.
Dang.
Sorry, buddy. Okay, next up. It is illegal to hold rituals that involve the ingestion of blood, urine, or fecal matter.
Leviticus.
That is Louisiana.
What?
Yes.
You can't do it in you can't do blood in Leviticus. I don't know if they ever mentioned fecal matter, but
I found it in one of those
well,
crazy
that makes
law
sense.
websites.
That should be illegal everywhere. I mean, I'm all for freedom of worship and stuff, but there has to be a line, like a health code line.
Okay, speaking of health code line, it is illegal to marry a tree, even if you know that tree really well.
Luke. Yeah. That last line was screaming that you wrote it. If you would have said it's illegal to marry a tree, I would have thought you were talking about Louisiana. I would have guessed that, but since you said, even if you know that tree really well, I was like, that's Luke.
Oh, man. Okay. Every time a person is seriously burned, he or she must report the injury to the authorities.
Leviticus.
It's Louisiana.
Come on.
You have to tell the fire marshal if you were burned every time.
This is tough.
All right, next up. It is illegal to end a worship session with the song, He's a Good, Good Father. Might be Leviticus. Yeah, all right, next up.
Yeah, I like that song, or?
I think it's played its course.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's run its course.
I was going to say, played his course.
Yeah.
Course.
Aha. All right, last one. It is illegal to cheer for anyone except the South Central Louisiana State Mud Dogs and their rising star linebacker, Bobby Boucher.
That's Luke.
Dang it, how'd you know?
Adam Sandler.
Andy, you did very well on this.
I did okay. There were some that I should have just known, you know.
Yeah, there's some wacky laws,
Yep.
both in Leviticus and in Louisiana and in my
Luke's
brain.
mind.
Yeah, so it works out quite well for us. All right, Andy, what do you know about the book of Leviticus?
Okay, well, we know that traditionally that Moses has been the attributed author.
Yep.
There's been recently, I think probably in the last century, there's been a lot of skeptical scholars or New Testament or Old Testament critics that have said it probably wasn't written by him, but written sometime in the time of David. Now, most scholars would say, most conservative Christian scholars would say that it at the very least was written and then updated along the way with different language by other people, but Moses wrote is attributed to Moses.
Right.
Purpose of it is just it's a continuation of after Exodus, and majority of Leviticus is Levitican law. It's the law about there's ceremonial laws, there's civil laws, and there's moral laws that are discussed in Leviticus.
Yep.
But
Real
it deals
quick on authorship before we move
Yeah.
forward. I'll say, for me, Jesus said, "You have heard Moses say," and then he'll quote from the Torah.
Yeah.
So, if Jesus attributes it, that's good enough for me.
Right.
I know that's not going to be everybody. There's people who are skeptical that are going to dive into that, and they look at language patterns, and they go really deep into it. So,
Sure.
I respect the people doing that work, but for me, if Jesus says Moses
thought
said
it,
it,
yeah.
that's good enough for me.
Sure.
I'm good to go.
The book deals predominantly with how to deal with that sin and impurity, specifically, obviously, with the Israelites.
Yeah. Let's talk about the different types of laws real quick, because I
Yeah.
think this is very important.
Sure.
And this is where you get into some of the wacky ones.
Yep.
Where you can't trim your eyebrows and you can't wear coats made
Mixed
of two different
clothing, yeah.
materials. So let's hit those categories again. So there are ceremonial laws.
Mm-hmm.
So what are ceremonial laws?
Ceremonial laws are how you as a person stay, to lack of a better term, ceremonially pure. So it's almost like if you were to put it in some sort of context today, it'd be like going to a very traditional church but wearing shorts.
Right.
Be a no-no. You can't do that.
Yep.
For back then, it was things like don't trim your hair a certain way, don't wear certain clothing.
So a lot of those are for the priests. So you read it, and it's not for each one saying this is only for a priest, this is only for a priest, but they would have known as reading and understanding it was for a priest.
Yep.
So the priest was to be the physical embodiment of God. So the priest had to be not physically deformed. The priest had to be holy as much as possible. They had to, the priest had to offer sacrifices for himself. He had to be as clean and pure as possible. Of course, he's human. He's going to be imperfect, but he had to, when people saw him, think, oh, that might kind of be how God looks. So some of the laws that you see that are kind of like, what is that all about? It was specifically for the priest to lead people in worship. And this would have been, again, very specific to that place and time.
Sure.
So what's the next category of laws then we're looking at?
Civil laws. And the civil laws, like today, would be speeding laws, traffic laws, that kind of stuff.
So again, very much about that place and time, that context and culture.
How you lived in your community.
So let's talk about like the dietary laws then, for example.
So they weren't allowed to eat shellfish. They weren't allowed to, as we talked, you couldn't eat an eel or anything like that. There's specific rules. And it wasn't, there's some people that theorize it is because those things weren't healthy, but that wasn't the point of it. The point of it, as God makes very clear, is to separate them from the people that were surrounding them.
Yep.
And so he gave them this law right before they entered the promised land.
Part of it too, though.
Yeah, but there's some things that they weren't allowed to eat that were not unhealthy, like rabbit. I mean, rabbit's not unhealthy to eat. They were just, and people would say, well, they couldn't eat this because they didn't have refrigeration. But they used salt for the lamb and like stuff, so
but it
wasn't the
it
predominant
kept them away
reason.
from blood, which a lot of diseases are carried in blood.
Definitely.
It kept them away from bottom feeders in the ocean, which could carry disease.
Sure.
You know, same pigs were unclean at the time.
Yeah.
Pigs, I can't remember exactly the phrasing of it, but something about the split hooves and didn't chew the cud.
Yep.
So I do think there could have been a secondary.
Yes, but it's not the predominant reason.
Not the predominant, but there was a secondary benefit in that the Israelites were kept healthy and strong because of some of these dietary laws. It didn't make sense to their neighbors.
Definitely.
But it, in that place and time and culture, helped them a ton.
Yep. And so again, those are the two categories, the civil and the ceremonial, that Christians are not, most would argue Christians aren't bound by today. But then you have the final category, the moral law.
I will say, though, before we just cast them out and say they're not important, they still do reveal the nature of God.
Of course.
They still reveal things about him. And I think they're interesting to study, and they do help us to study today.
Yes, I agree.
All right, so how about moral?
The moral law are things like the Ten Commandments. These are laws that that are eternal in a sense. They apply back then and they continue to apply today, like don't murder, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet, that kind of stuff. Those are things that no matter what cultural context you live in, that they apply and they are binding on you. So you should live that way regardless. And Jesus affirms that in the New Testament over and over again.
Agreed.
So those are the three categories. Now, what's important for Leviticus is that it is a very difficult book to understand because there's so many weird things, like the things we just brought up. So the ESV Study Bible has a section in their notes called the Interpretive Issues in Leviticus, and so I outlined a few of them for us.
All right, let's do it.
So as to kind of help. So these are going to be important for the readers when you're reading through Leviticus to remember these so that you can ask the right questions when you're reading. The first category is ritual versus ethical commands. Kind of already talked about that, but in the context of the New Covenant, it is important that as Christians, we know that some of the commands are ritual in nature, or we'll say ceremonial in nature, and specific to Israel's context at that time, and other commands are ethical commands that people ought to follow. So that we just talked about.
Yeah, I mean, for an example, it'd be like a priestly garment that they had to wear. Like they would have to wear that year after year, day after day, and it was a way of linking them to the past, remembering, who God was. There was symbolism in the colors that were used, and the different tribes were represented. So the Bible gets very specific about what kind of garment a priest has to use. If you go to church today, you look at what the priest wear, the pastor wears, whatever, you're going to see it's going to look very different. So we are not bound to this law anymore. It was ritually set up, and it had a specific purpose for that place and time.
So those are the ritual versus ethical commands, and they would put, the ESV put ritual with civil and ceremonial kind of together. Then there's knowing the difference between unclean, clean, and holy, and these words refer to a ritual state. So the state that a person is in or an animal is in. So these states, people are, for instance, determine their participation in things like a peace offering. So when you read about the peace offering, if you weren't clean, you had to get clean before you could participate.
Yeah, and the whole idea of being ceremonially clean, I believe, again, this helped keep the Israelites clean and healthy.
Sure.
So they would like wash their hands before they ate, which none of the other tribes did.
Right.
And there were great health benefits for that. Again, I don't think it was the main reason why God had them to do that. It was so they would separate from the other tribes around them and stand out a little bit. But it did help them to stay clean and holy when they would approach God.
Yeah, I agree.
Interesting, too, when you see Jesus doesn't worry about this too much. And that was partly what the Pharisees were so up in arms about, is because they were so focused on these ceremonial hand washing and cleanliness laws. You know, Jesus let unclean women touch him, which would have made him ceremonially unclean. But being that he was God, he was, never ceremonially unclean. So pretty fascinating to look at.
So the ESV offers a modern analogy of this type of thing. So a person who is registered to vote can, whereas a person who isn't registered to vote cannot vote. So that's kind of like a modern analogy.
Like it.
Then you have rituals and ceremonies. Leviticus typically doesn't explain what the rituals mean. So Moses will just introduce a ritual and it'll just be like, that's what happens. There's no like, this is why, except for like, they say for the blood in particular, you don't consume blood because it is the lifeline for everything.
Right.
Generally speaking, rituals may function.
I'll say on that so you're coming out of a tribal society where they didn't understand how the body functioned very much, and they thought that trapped in the blood was an animal or a person's kind of soul and spirit.
Yeah.
And a lot of other tribes, they believe that you would take on characteristics of that animal or that people by drinking their blood. They believe that life was bound up in it. So the Israelites were to never consume blood. And also the Bible says that there's no forgiveness without the shedding of blood.
Yep.
So the blood was to be revered, and that was sacred, that was for God. And then through that, the Israelites also didn't receive some of the bloodborne pathogens and other problems that come with consuming blood.
And it goes back to what we talked about in our Exodus episode, the 10 Commandments. God's laws are meant to be good for you. They're not just because he's God. It's just because they're good
doesn't
for
want you to have any fun and limit your freedom.
So they would say, generally speaking, rituals may function in 3 different ways. They can address certain aspects of the human condition. They can help the offerer to express emotions or desires to God, and they can show the various truths about God or the human condition.
Cool.
Then we have how are they relevant to Christians today? The sacrificial system, so sacrificing animals for sin, obviously has ceased. Jesus took that on himself. The festal calendar in Leviticus 23.
Real quick before we move on. So I do think that the sacrificial system in place pointed to Christ.
Yeah.
In Hebrews it says that the old system was a shadow of that which was to come. So it's even more impactful if you think about a first century Jew who understood and lived in the sacrificial system.
Right.
They knew what was required of them, what the cost was to become pure enough to worship and to have your sins forgiven. And it cost a lot. I mean, they were heavily taxed to do that. They went through a lot of trouble to do that. And for Jesus to just say your sins are forgiven, it would have been shocking.
It would have been crazy for them.
Right. So understanding the system that was in place does help really bring a new dimension to Jesus' sacrifice and forgiveness. That I think is important for us to understand today.
Yep, it's why the New Testament authors called him the Lamb of God and that kind of stuff. And it goes back to even Passover. I mean, there's a lot of these weird things you see in the Old Testament aren't just weird things. They, like you said, they point to something much greater. Then we see the festal calendar. So when he talks about in Leviticus 23, the different feasts in Leviticus, like the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Harvest, and the Feast of Booths, Christians have taken those and where they situate on the calendar, and those are they find their climax or the way that they kind of are revealed are in Good Friday, Easter, and actually Pentecost.
Cool.
So that's pretty cool. And then finally, the Levitical Holiness Code reveals the kind of moral conduct that is either pleasing or displeasing to God. So that moral section that we talked about, those things are still pleasing or displeasing to God, to not murder, to not steal, that kind of stuff.
Cool.
And then before we get in the text, the last thing, the couple themes we're going to see throughout the book of Leviticus is that God is present, that God's people must be holy or separate, Spiritual leaders actually bear a heavier responsibility than others, and atonement is a gracious act of the Lord.
Very good. So let's go ahead and get into our text. We're going to be reading from the New Living Translation. If you want to follow along with us, you can do that. If you're listening on your own, you can journal. We're going to have some questions along the way. If you're listening with a group of friends, you can stop the podcast and discuss. And if you don't want to do either of those, that's fine. Just sit back, listen, and we'll do our best to answer the questions afterward. So we'll begin here, Leviticus 19, verses 1 through 2. The Lord also said to Moses, "Give the following instruction to the entire community of Israel. You must be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy." So, just kind of kicking it off here, Andy, short and sweet. In what ways can you pursue holiness today? Is it possible?
I think it is. I don't think it's possible to be perfectly holy on this side of heaven, but we're supposed to pursue it. He says to go for it. Now, God looks at us, and we know this from after Jesus' resurrection, that we are justified, and so God declares us as righteous and perfect and holy and blameless. But we know that declaration doesn't just make us holy here. It's just that God sees us that way, and then we're now in the process of what theologians call sanctification, of being made perfect.
Yep.
So we can pursue it, and we should, and Christians should pursue holiness. We're not going to achieve it until our death.
Yeah, I love Andy Stanley talks about moral purity and how it's just so come out of fashion. You know, in today's culture, being bad is good and being good is bad. I mean, it's really flipped on itself. And the idea of purity, we don't ever talk about purity unless it's water. But moral purity is worth pursuing, and it does lead to more freedom, which is counterintuitive. You know, you limit the things that you do and you find more freedom. It doesn't seem possible, but I love Celebrate Recovery. It's all about finding freedom for everybody. It's a ministry that we have here that is 12-step based, but also based on the principles of Scripture and trying to purify yourself by seeking after God. You know, we don't need to become ceremonially clean anymore, but we can throw off behaviors that are not helpful and don't help us in our relationship with God. So, I think we can absolutely pursue holiness today. I think the Bible needs to play a prominent part in our lives. Reading the Bible doesn't make you a holy or spiritual person, but I don't know anybody close to God that doesn't take the Bible seriously every day.
Right, I agree. I think a solid prayer life is another thing that people, Christians, if they want to pursue holiness, should pursue, because God reveals himself and through prayer and predominantly through the Scriptures, but he can help you to understand the Scriptures better through prayer. And so there's disciplines really are the thing we're hitting on here, the spiritual disciplines. And then, accountability with your close friends and other Christians.
Love it. All right, Andy, you want to give us Leviticus 22, 17 through 30?
It says, "And the Lord said to Moses, give Aaron and his sons and all the Israelites these instructions, which apply both to native Israelites and to the foreigners living among you. If you present a gift as a burnt offering to the Lord, whether it is to fulfill a vow or as a voluntary offering, you will be accepted only if your offering is a male animal with no defects. It may be a bull, a ram, or a male goat. Do not present an animal with defects, because the Lord will not accept it on your behalf. If you present a peace offering to the Lord from the herd or the flock, whether it is to fulfill a vow or as a voluntary offering, you must offer a perfect animal. It may have no defect of any kind. You must not offer an animal that is blind, crippled, or injured, or that has a wart, a skin sore, or scabs. Such animals must never be offered on the altar as special gifts to the Lord. If a bull or lamb has a leg that is too long or too short, it may be offered as a voluntary offering, but it may not be offered to fulfill a vow. If an animal has damaged testicles or is castrated, you may not offer it to the Lord. You must never do this in your own land, and you must not accept such an animal from foreigners and then offer it as a sacrifice to your God. Such animals will not be accepted on your behalf, for they are mutilated or defective. And the Lord said to Moses, when a calf or lamb or goat is born, it must be left with its mother for 7 days. From the 8th day on, it will be acceptable as a special gift to the Lord. But you must not slaughter a mother animal and her offspring on the same day, whether from the herd or the flock. When you bring a thanksgiving offering to the Lord, sacrifice it properly, so you'll be accepted. Eat the entire sacrificial animal on the day it is presented. Do not leave any of it until the next morning. I am the Lord.
All right, so we're reading a little bit here about the different sacrifices and what is acceptable, what is not acceptable to God. And I think the main thing you have to understand here is that male animals that were without defect were the most expensive animals.
Yep.
Like that's what would fetched the highest price, I guess. That's what provided the most meat. That was the most desirable offering.
Yep.
So
and it could, like with the female animals, they're pregnant and then they're out of commission for a while to produce more animals, whereas the males could just keep mating and keep mating, keep mating.
right. Yeah, well, and that's part of, I mean, it's kind of weird, but you think, gosh, damaged testicles, what's that all about?
Right.
If you have an animal that is castrated, it's not as valuable because
Right.
it can't produce more animals for you.
Yep.
So, basically the idea here is that you got to give God your best. You can't just pick your weakly sick animal that, it's going to die anyway, whatever. Like the best of your flock, that is what you should be giving to God and sacrificing to him, that God, he desires and I think deserves our best. So, Andy, our question here then is, when do you feel like you are giving God your best?
In many different contexts, it's usually when, if I'm giving, like giving money, whether it's a tithe or a gift to an organization or whatever, it's when I'm not necessarily giving out of a surplus, but giving out of a compulsion that I feel from God.
Yeah.
But in a different context, I think it's when I'm using the gifts that God has given me to then benefit other people. So when I have people that ask me questions about what I think about a particular passage, I love to look up the answers to that and then provide for them my thoughts. And in that way, I feel like I'm serving God and I'm giving him my best because I'm using what he's given me. But that could be any context for serving.
Cool. Yeah, I thought of serving as well. I don't remember where I heard it, but somewhere I heard the challenge. If you can serve someone and it's going to be 30 minutes or less, do it. What's 30 minutes of your day?
Right.
You can't always do a grand gesture where you just like, I'm not going to work today. I'm going to go help my buddy move to California or something. I don't know. Like, I guess once in a while you could do that, but
yeah, I mean, that's nice.
If it's going to be 30 minutes or less from my day, I am not so self-important that I can't give that up, set it aside, and help somebody with something. So I do feel like I'm giving God my best when I'm serving his people.
Yeah.
And I can't say I always do it as much as I should, but
Sure.
But man, it does feel good. There's a difference between being tired and weary. When you do something that has no purpose, no point, you become weary. Like, gosh, what's the point of all this? But there's something to be said about feeling tired from working hard, but satisfied at the same time.
I agree.
Sweet. All right, well, let's move it right along here. We're going to look at Leviticus 9, 1 through 7. After the ordination ceremony on the 8th day, Moses called together Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. He said to Aaron, "Take a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering, both without defects, and present them to the Lord. Then tell the Israelites, take a male goat for a sin offering, and take a calf and a lamb, both a year old without defects, for a burnt offering. Also take a bull and a ram for a peace offering, and flour moistened with olive oil for a grain offering. Present all these things to the Lord, because the Lord will appear to you today." So the people presented all the things at the entrance of the tabernacle, just as Moses had commanded. Then the whole community came forward and stood before the Lord. And Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded you to do, so that the glory of the Lord may appear to you." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Come to the altar and sacrifice your sin offering and your burnt offering to purify yourself and the people. Then present the offerings of the people to purify them, making them right with the Lord, just as he had commanded." All right, so Aaron is commanded here to present an offering and a sacrifice, both for himself and for the people.
Yeah.
So, Andy, talk about here the idea of a priest kind of presenting an offering for all the people at once. What's that all about?
Well, we see even from when Moses had led the Israelites through the Exodus out of Egypt, he was the representative from the people, from God to the people, and then also from the people to God. And then there was kind of like where he instituted Jethro and obviously Aaron. But there's always been this, I think Tim Keller talks about it, the king, the priest, and the prophet. And so here, the priest represents the people to God. So he, in a sense, and that's why they call in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews calls Jesus the high priest. Our high priest, because he's representing the people to God. He's the mediator. He's pleading on our behalf. So the priest's function, one of the main functions of the priest in the Old Testament, was to bring the sins of the people in the form of an animal to God so that God could atone for those sins.
It's kind of interesting. The priest had to wear a bunch of bells. They would tie a rope around him.
Yeah.
So that if he died, they could just
pull him out.
Pull him out.
And not go in
hey,
there.
There's no bells jingling. Pull him on back.
That's how serious it was.
It was serious. I mean, the high priest had to take his job very seriously. And, I mean, you see instances here where the high priest burns the wrong kind of incense. They just get sloppy. And they're like, yeah, whatever, that's good enough. And God takes their life.
Yep.
Because they didn't treat their position with the utmost respect.
Right.
I you know, none of us can present our own sacrifice for the sins of others. Like, that's impossible. You can't atone for the sins of other people. But in essence, that's what Jesus does. Jesus is the high priest, and he's the sacrifice all at once, and the last sacrifice needed. So when you look at the high priest here, you look at the priests, what they're doing, as you said, is they're going to God and pleading for God to not pour his wrath on the people. You know, God, we're going to sacrifice this animal, put your wrath and your punishment on this animal. Because God is God and God is just, you can't just wink at sin like, it's okay, sin disappears. Like, there still had to be wrath carried out. And the priest is interceding, asking God to give the people grace, to give them mercy. And man, I love the symbolism. It's a fascinating study. If you ever get a chance, read Leviticus and then read Hebrews, and you see so much of the symbolism back and forth. But Jesus is the last high priest needed. And what Jesus does is he intercedes between us and God, and he also gives us close proximity to God like never before. When Jesus says it's finished, the temple and the curtain tears, and that curtain is what separated the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber, from the place that the priest could be. And when Jesus dies and that curtain tears, it shows that we can now boldly approach God's throne. Because of Jesus' sacrifice and the way that he has pleaded, God has accepted it, and we have direct, straight access to God. We don't have to go through a priest. We don't have to go through a whole sacrificial system. We don't need somebody to continue to try to atone for our sins. The work is done.
Yeah, I agree. It's pretty fascinating. So in this, it's almost like when I was reading this, I was thinking about how this is like a public confession when the priest has to bring his animal for not only his sin or their sins, but his sins.
Right.
And there is power in confession. So our question for you guys is, talk about a time when you've experienced the power of confession.
Gosh. Both either my own or someone else's?
Sure.
Well, I'm sure I've confessed plenty of stuff at different times to different people, but I guess it's kind of odd as a pastor in that you meet people and they just open up and kind of share all their dirty laundry with you right off the bat. I met with a guy, I'm not going to say his name, but it was like last week, and he wanted to meet and just talk. I'm not gonna reveal too much here, but he opened it with, I really have my bleep together, which is an interesting way to try to impress your pastor.
Yep.
But as we talked and he kind of broke down, I was really proud of him because he's like, I realized that I need to be a spiritual leader, and I'm not. What do I do?
Yeah.
And got him a Bible, and it's just funny because I've talked with a guy literally 10 minutes, and it was like all the good, the bad, everything. We just started pulling it out piece by piece.
Yeah.
So I'm sure counselors probably feel that way at times too. And I don't claim to be a counselor or anything like that, but there is truly power in confession. And once you bring something out of the darkness into the light, God can work on it. I get really excited every time I hear somebody say, I've never told anyone this before, but when that happens, I know that God's about to do something big. They're about to take something that they have wrestled with in the dark. They're going to bring it into the light, and now God can start to work on it.
Yeah, I agree. I have some close friends that I feel comfortable in confessing to, and not comfortable because I'm like, I'll just tell them and they'll be fine with it. Comfortable because the same thing, I know that you get excited when people confess, but if I'm struggling with something and I go to like one in particular is Nick, if I confess something to him, it's never like, it's cool, dude, God forgives you, you're fine. It's always like, that's not good. What are you going to do about it? And then we have like a really good conversation. He prays over me, and so every time that I confess anything to Nick, he has, God uses that time, and it is a powerful time for both of us. And so he confesses things to me. And so it's even anything from I got really angry at my kids today, or at Ruby today, because she just wasn't listening and I lost my temper. I confess that to him. We could talk about it. And this is a pattern. And so I think that there's power anytime anybody confesses anything. And that would be, I think that my encouragement to listeners is to practice that art, because it's a good art to practice for sure.
So your homework is carefront someone in your life this week.
Carefront.
Just kidding.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, it's terrible.
It's very nice.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for us today for this, for Leviticus. There's a lot more to read, though.
Man, there is some crazy stuff in Leviticus.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're flying here as we're going through it, but go through it with a study Bible. If you just read it on your own, you're going to get lost a little bit, but
Yep.
You can, if you do have like a life application Bible, get a good study Bible. It will help you break it down and understand it, because there is a lot of really rich stuff to be gleaned here.
Yeah, agreed.
Sweet. All right. Well, if you want to get a hold of us, you can email us, podcast@cedarcreek.tv. You can find us on Facebook. We're also on Twitter, Luke Shortridge, Andy Rechtenwald. If you want to leave us a review in the iTunes store, that will help other people find the show.
Yeah.
So go on iTunes and rate us. Android phones, I guess you do whatever you do. It would be great.
Every time.
There you go. Hey, you know, and if you have any feedback for us, like you think Andy's really killing it on the trivia or anything like that, send us that feedback, and we might even mention it on the show. Who knows?
Fantastic.
So next up is the incredible, always exciting, fascinating book of Numbers. There you go. No, it'll be good. It's fun.
I hope so.
All right. Thanks for joining us, guys. Until next time.
See ya.
Leviticus.
Numbers.
Deuteronomy. Joshua.